The temperature inside Thomas Brennan's cabin measured 68 degrees warmer at floor level than any other structure within 50 miles of Fort Benton, Montana, and not a single neighbor could explain how his family walked barefoot on wooden planks in the middle of January 1842. What they didn't know was that beneath those planks ran a system so counterintuitive to frontier logic that when Thomas first proposed it, the entire settlement had declared him insane. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier innovation interest you, subscribe because tomorrow's story might just change how you think about survival in the wilderness. Thomas Brennan found the Hartwell boy on the morning of February 3, 1841, approximately 30 yards from the Hartwell family cabin. The child was 7 years old. His name was Daniel. He had frozen to death sometime during the night after wandering outside in confusion, a common symptom of severe hypothermia that experienced frontiersmen called snow madness. The boy's parents discovered he was missing at dawn. Thomas joined the search party that formed immediately. He was the one who spotted the small form partially covered by snow that had fallen in the hours before sunrise. Daniel Hartwell had died less than 100 feet from safety, but the tragic irony wasn't the proximity to his family's cabin. It was what had driven him outside in the first place. Thomas had known the Hartwell family for 2 years. Marcus Hartwell was a competent trapper and farmer who had moved his wife and 3 children to the Montana Territory in 1839, drawn by opportunities in the declining but still profitable fur trade and the promise of land. Their cabin was solid construction by frontier standards: notched log walls, a functional fireplace, a door that closed properly, and oiled paper windows that let in light while blocking wind. Marcus was careful and thorough. His family should have been safe. But Montana winters were brutal in ways that settlers from eastern states couldn't fully comprehend until they experienced them firsthand. Temperatures regularly dropped below zero for weeks at a time. The wind came down from the northern plains with nothing to stop it, finding every gap in every wall, every crack around every door. Cabins that seemed solid in autumn became torture chambers by January. Families survived by maintaining fires constantly, burning wood at rates that required each household to stockpile several cords just to make it through the coldest months. The Hartwell cabin had a problem common to frontier construction. The fireplace was efficient at producing heat directly in front of it, creating a zone of relative warmth extending perhaps 6 feet from the hearth. Beyond that radius, the temperature dropped rapidly. The corners of the cabin, the areas farthest from the fire, remained cold enough that water left overnight would freeze solid. The family slept as close to the fireplace as safety allowed, but even so, the sleeping area remained uncomfortably cold. Children especially suffered because their smaller bodies lost heat faster than adults. On the night of February 2nd, Daniel Hartwell had gone to sleep wrapped in blankets near the fire. His parents checked on all 3 children before they slept. Everything seemed normal. But sometime in the deepest part of night, when the fire had burned down to coals and the interior temperature dropped toward freezing, Daniel began showing signs of hypothermia. His body temperature fell. His mental state deteriorated. In his confusion, he apparently believed he was overheating, a paradoxical sensation that hypothermia victims often experience. He threw off his blankets. He moved away from the fire. At some point, he opened the cabin door and walked outside into air that was 20 degrees below zero. His parents never heard him leave. By the time they discovered his absence at first light, he had been exposed to lethal cold for perhaps 5 hours. Thomas helped carry the small frozen body back to the cabin. He stayed while Marcus and his wife Sarah prepared their son for burial. He attended the service 2 days later. When they laid Daniel in ground, they had to thaw with fires before they could dig. He watched Marcus's face during the burial and saw something he recognized: guilt. The specific guilt of a competent man who had done everything reasonable and still failed to protect his family. Thomas couldn't stop thinking about the Hartwell boy. He had seen death before on the frontier. Men died from bear attacks, from accidents, from disease, from violence. Those deaths were tragic but somehow comprehensible. They resulted from specific dangers that could be identified and potentially avoided. Daniel Hartwell's death was different. The boy had died inside what should have been sanctuary. He had died because the very shelter meant to protect him couldn't maintain livable temperature throughout its interior. Thomas began paying attention to cabin temperatures in a way he never had before. His own cabin was similar to the Hartwell structure: single-room, fireplace on one wall, sleeping area as close to the heat source as possible. He started measuring conditions systematically. He didn't have thermometers, but he didn't need precise instruments to understand the problem. He placed cups of water in different locations throughout his cabin and checked them each morning. The cup near the fireplace remained liquid. The cup in the far corner froze solid every night, despite the fire burning continuously. He visited other cabins in the scattered settlement around Fort Benton and observed the same pattern everywhere. Families clustered near fires. Children slept in parents' beds for warmth. The corners and outer walls of every cabin remained brutally cold. No matter how much wood burned, people accepted this as inevitable. Winter meant cold. Cabins provided shelter from wind and precipitation, but maintaining warmth throughout the interior was impossible. That was simply how things were. Thomas couldn't accept that conclusion. He was 32 years old, originally from Pennsylvania, where he had worked as a millwright before heading west in 1836. His trade involved understanding mechanical systems, water flow, power transmission. He approached problems methodically, breaking them into components that could be analyzed and potentially solved. The cabin heating problem seemed amenable to that approach. Heat was being produced. Heat was being lost. The challenge was distribution and retention. The fundamental issue was straightforward. Fireplaces heated air directly in front of them through radiation. That heated air rose toward the ceiling and eventually dispersed, but most of the heat energy went straight up the chimney. The floor remained cold because heat didn't naturally move downward. Cold air sank, warm air rose, and the floor was where cold air pooled. Families were trying to stay warm in the coldest part of the cabin while heat escaped through the roof. Thomas started sketching ideas in a journal he kept. Most involved attempting to redirect heat from the fireplace using sheet metal reflectors or enclosed chambers. None seemed practical given available materials and the limited space inside a cabin. He needed a different approach entirely. He needed to heat the cabin from below rather than from one wall. He needed to make the floor itself warm. That thought seemed absurd even to him, but once it occurred to him, he couldn't dismiss it. Thomas had learned his trade from a German immigrant named Heinrich Vogel, who operated a mill outside Pittsburgh. Heinrich had trained in Europe, where engineering traditions stretched back centuries. He had taught Thomas not just how to build mill machinery, but how to think about mechanical problems systematically. One principle Heinrich emphasized repeatedly was that nature provided free power if you understood how to harness it. Water fell downhill and could turn wheels. Wind moved consistently in certain locations and could drive pumps. Heat moved from hot objects to cold objects and could be directed if you understood the principles. Heinrich had shown Thomas a curious device he called a thermosophon. It was a simple loop of copper pipe connected to a water tank. When you heated the bottom of the loop, water inside began circulating without any pump. Hot water rose because it was less dense than cold water. As it rose and moved away from the heat source, it cooled and became denser, sinking back down. The cycle continued as long as heat was applied. Heinrich used this principle to circulate warm water through his mill building during winter, heating it with waste heat from the mechanical systems. Thomas had found the device interesting, but hadn't thought about it in years. Now it seemed potentially relevant. If water could circulate through pipes, using only heat and gravity, And if that circulating water could transfer heat to its surroundings, then perhaps a similar system could heat a cabin. The challenge was distribution. Heinrich's mill was large with high ceilings. The thermosiphon pipes ran along walls and across ceilings where they didn't interfere with work. A cabin had no such space. Pipes running along walls would be in the way. Pipes across the ceiling would look ridiculous and wouldn't heat the floor. Thomas kept returning to his earlier thought. The floor needed to be warm. The floor was where cold air settled. If you could heat the floor, warm air would rise naturally and distribute throughout the cabin. But how could you heat a floor? The only way would be to put the heat source beneath the floor. That seemed impossible. You couldn't build a fire under a wooden floor, but you could potentially run hot water under the floor if you could figure out how to install pipes without destroying the structure's integrity. The idea crystallized over several weeks. A thermosiphon loop that ran beneath the cabin floor, heated by the fireplace, circulating continuously. The pipes would transfer heat to the earth beneath the floor. The earth would absorb that heat and radiate it upward through the floorboards. The floor would become warm. The entire cabin would heat from below. It was theoretically sound based on principles Heinrich had taught him. Whether it was practically achievable was another question entirely. Thomas spent the remainder of February and all of March 1841 planning his system. He had no formal training in thermodynamics or heat transfer, but he understood the basic principles well enough to work out a functional design. The key components were simple. A water reservoir near the fireplace that could be heated. A large pipe running beneath the floor that would carry hot water away from the heat source. A return path that brought cooled water back to be reheated. The entire loop had to be pitched correctly so gravity would drive circulation. The challenge was materials. Pipes were expensive on the frontier. Small diameter copper or iron pipes could be purchased at trading posts for astronomical prices, brought in by steamboat from St. Louis. Those small pipes wouldn't work for his purposes. He needed large diameter pipe to carry enough water volume to transfer meaningful heat. He needed something robust enough to bury in earth without corroding. He needed approximately 30 feet of pipe to run the length of his cabin and back. In early April, Thomas traveled to Fort Benton to investigate options. The fort served as a major trading post and river landing. Steamboats arrived regularly during high water months, bringing supplies from civilization. Thomas spoke with the post trader about large diameter pipes. The trader looked at him skeptically. What would a trapper need with one? Industrial pipe? Thomas explained he wanted to build a water heating system. The trader's skepticism deepened, but business was business. He could order pipe from St. Louis if Thomas was serious. The price was shocking. A single section of 12-inch diameter riveted iron pipe, 10 feet long, cost $40. Thomas would need at least 3 sections plus joints and fittings. The total cost would exceed $120, more than most trappers earned in a full season. Thomas had saved money over his years in Montana, living frugally and investing his trapping profits carefully. He had approximately $200 in credit at the fort. Spending more than half his savings on an unproven heating experiment seemed insane by any rational standard. He placed the order anyway. The trader wrote it down with obvious doubt that Thomas would follow through when the pipe actually arrived. Thomas paid a deposit and arranged to be notified when the steamboat delivered his materials. Then he returned to his cabin and began the next phase of preparation. He needed to understand exactly how his floor was constructed and how he could modify it to accommodate the pipe system without destroying the cabin's structural integrity. His cabin was built on a site he had selected in 1837. The floor was wooden planks laid directly on leveled earth. The planks ran perpendicular to the long axis of the cabin. They weren't attached to any substructure, simply laid in place and held by their own weight. This was typical frontier construction: quick, simple, functional. It also meant he could remove the floor entirely without affecting the walls or roof. The steamboat arrived at Fort Benton on May 23, 1841. Thomas received word 3 days later when a trader's messenger rode out to his cabin. He rode to the fort immediately and found his pipe sections stacked on the landing dock. Each section was 10 feet long, 12 inches in diameter, made from riveted iron sheets formed into cylinders. The metal was thick, perhaps a quarter inch, and each section weighed approximately 80 pounds. The joints and fittings added another 30 pounds to the total load. Thomas paid the remaining balance and arranged transport. He couldn't carry everything himself. He hired 2 men with a wagon to haul the pipes to his cabin, paying them $5 for the day's work. The men loaded the sections carefully, curious about what this trapper planned to do with industrial equipment. Thomas offered no explanations. The wagon made the journey to his property in one long day, arriving at dusk. The men helped unload the pipes near the cabin entrance, collected their payment, and left shaking their heads. Thomas spent that evening examining his materials. The pipe sections were well made, manufactured in an eastern foundry to specifications meant for industrial steam systems or municipal waterworks. The rivets were solid, the seams tight. Each section had a slight taper at one end that would fit into the next section, creating a joined pipe run. The fittings included 2 90-degree elbows and several straight connectors with gasket material to ensure watertight seals. He laid out the components in the configuration he had planned. The system would start with a reservoir near the fireplace. From there, pipe would run along the length of the cabin beneath the floor, make a turn at the far end, and return parallel to the outbound section. The return pipe would connect back to the reservoir, completing the loop. Total pipe run would be approximately 28 feet. The system would be pitched slightly downward as it moved away from the heat source, then pitched upward on the return. This would encourage circulation by allowing hot water to rise naturally and cool water to descend. The next morning, Thomas began removing his floor. He started at the end, farthest from the fireplace, prying up planks and stacking them carefully outside. He had lived in this cabin for 4 years. The floor was familiar territory, worn smooth by his boots, marked by dropped tools and spilled coffee. Now he was tearing it apart based on a theory about heat transfer and gravity-driven water circulation. If he was wrong, he would have destroyed his home and wasted his savings on buried pipe that accomplished nothing. The work was straightforward but time-consuming. Each plank had to be removed without splitting the wood because he would need to reinstall them later. By the end of the first day, he had removed approximately half the floor, exposing the earth beneath. The dirt was packed hard from years of supporting the planks and his weight moving across them. He would need to excavate trenches in this earth deep enough to accommodate the pipes, plus surrounding material for heat transfer. Thomas began digging on May 26th. He marked his trench lines using string and stakes, creating 2 parallel channels running the length of the cabin. The outbound trench would carry hot water from the fireplace end to the far wall. The return trench would bring cooled water back. Each trench needed to be 18 inches deep and 16 inches wide to accommodate the 12-inch pipe, plus surrounding earth that would serve as thermal mass. The digging was brutal work. The earth inside the cabin was protected from rain, but still contained clay layers that required picks to break apart. Thomas worked alone, chipping away at the hard-packed soil, filling buckets, carrying the excavated material outside. He couldn't simply pile it inside the cabin because he needed floor space to work. Every bucket of earth had to be hauled out the door and dumped in a growing mound beside the structure. Progress was measured in inches per hour. By the end of the first day, he had excavated approximately 6 feet of the outbound trench. At that rate, completing both trenches would take more than a week. His back ached from the constant bending and lifting. His hands developed blisters that broke and bled before forming calluses. He worked through pain and fatigue because stopping meant admitting the entire project might be foolish. On the 3rd day of excavation, A neighbor named Robert Sutter stopped by. Robert had a claim about 2 miles east and occasionally visited to trade news and supplies. He stood in the doorway of Thomas's cabin staring at the torn-up floor and the trenches taking shape in the exposed earth. He asked what Thomas was doing. Thomas explained he was installing a heating system that would warm the floor. Robert listened to the description with growing disbelief. "You're burying pipe in your floor to heat it with water?" Thomas confirmed this was exactly his plan. Robert laughed, not cruelly but with genuine amusement at the absurdity. He said Thomas had lost his mind, wished him luck, and rode away still chuckling. The encounter bothered Thomas more than he wanted to admit. Robert Sutter was a reasonable man, practical and experienced. If Robert thought the project was insane, others would too. Thomas considered abandoning the work. He could fill in the trenches, replace the floor, and sell the pipes at a loss. He would be out significant money, but could return to normal life without being known as the fool who tore up his cabin for a heating fantasy. He continued digging instead. By June 1st, both trenches were complete. They ran parallel down the length of his cabin, each approximately 15 feet long, 18 inches deep, perfectly straight. The excavation had taken 7 days of hard labor. The cabin looked like a construction disaster. Earth was piled outside. The floor was gone. Trenches gaped in the exposed ground. Thomas stood in the doorway looking at what he had done and felt a moment of doubt so strong it nearly overwhelmed his conviction. Then he thought about Daniel Hartwell freezing 30 yards from safety, and he went to begin installing the pipes. Installing the pipe system required precision Thomas hadn't fully anticipated. The sections were heavy and awkward to maneuver in the confined space of the trenches. Each piece had to be positioned correctly, aligned with the next section, and joined in a way that would create watertight seals while allowing for thermal expansion. He started with the outbound run, lowering the first pipe section into the trench nearest the fireplace. The pipe rested on the bottom of the trench with several inches of clearance on all sides. Thomas had planned this spacing deliberately. The gap would be filled with earth that would absorb heat from the pipe and transfer it upward toward the floor. But first he needed to complete the entire pipe run and test it for leaks. He positioned the second section so its tapered end slid into the first section's receiving end. The fit was snug but not perfect. Water could potentially leak at this joint under pressure. Thomas had purchased gasket material specifically for sealing the joints. The material was thick fiber impregnated with tar, designed to compress under pressure and conform to irregular surfaces. He wrapped the gasket around the male end of each pipe section before sliding it into the female receiver. Then he drove iron wedges into the gap between sections, forcing them together and compressing the gasket. The process required careful hammering to avoid damaging the pipes while ensuring tight connections. The straight sections went together over the course of 2 days. The elbows presented a different challenge. Each 90-degree fitting had to be positioned precisely to turn the pipe run at the far end of the cabin and begin the return path. The angles had to be exact, or the return trench wouldn't align properly. Thomas measured, adjusted, measured again, and finally committed to the positioning. He installed the first elbow, creating the turn from outbound to return flow. With the basic pipe run assembled, Thomas faced the most complex part of the system. He needed to create a reservoir near the fireplace that could be heated directly and would feed the pipe loop. The reservoir also needed to receive water returning from the cold end of the loop, completing the circulation path. He had designed a solution using a large iron pot he had purchased at Fort Benton, a vessel meant for rendering fat or boiling laundry, but repurposed for his heating system. The pot held approximately 8 gallons. Thomas positioned it on stones next to his fireplace where flames could heat it directly. He drilled holes near the bottom and top of the pot and threaded short pipe sections through them. The bottom connection would feed hot water into the outbound pipe run. The top connection would receive cooled water from the return pipe. Gaskets and wedges sealed these connections. The entire assembly looked crude but functional. He connected the outbound pipe to the bottom reservoir outlet and the return pipe to the top inlet. The loop was complete. Water added to the reservoir could theoretically circulate through the buried pipes and return continuously as long as heat was applied. Whether it would actually work remained to be tested. Thomas filled the reservoir on June 8th using water hauled from the creek in buckets. He poured carefully, watching the level rise in the iron pot while listening for sounds of leaking from the buried pipes. The water level climbed slowly. When it reached the top connection point, he stopped and waited. 5 minutes passed. No water pooled in the trenches. The joints were holding. He added more water until the reservoir was 3/4 full, leaving space for thermal expansion. The total system held approximately 15 gallons. Thomas had calculated this volume based on the pipe diameter and length. 15 gallons of water weighed roughly 120 pounds. That mass of water, heated and circulated through the buried pipes, should transfer substantial heat energy to the surrounding earth. He built a fire in his fireplace, a small, careful fire using dry wood that would burn hot and clean. Flames rose around the reservoir pot, heating the iron directly. Thomas sat and watched. Heat transfer took time. The metal had to warm first, then the water inside had to heat, then circulation had to begin. He didn't expect immediate results. After 30 minutes, he placed his hand on the outbound pipe where it emerged from the reservoir. The metal was warm to the touch. Heat was transferring from the fire to the water to the pipe. He moved to the far end of the cabin where the pipe made its turn. That section was still cool. The heated water hadn't reached it yet, or circulation hadn't started. An hour passed. Thomas maintained the fire at steady temperature, adding wood periodically. He checked the far end again. The pipe was warmer now, noticeably warmer than ambient temperature. Something was happening. Water was moving through the system, carrying heat from the fireplace to the buried pipes. He knelt and placed his palm on the earth beside the trench. It felt slightly warm, though that might have been imagination. 2 hours into the test, Thomas was certain the system was working. The outbound pipe near the reservoir was hot enough that he couldn't hold his hand on it for more than a few seconds. The far end was warm. The return pipe was cooler than the outbound, but warmer than it had been initially. Water was circulating. The thermosophon principle Heinrich had taught him was functioning exactly as theory predicted. Hot water rose from the reservoir into the outbound pipe, traveled the length of the cabin, turned at the elbow, and returned through the second pipe to enter the reservoir at the top. He let the fire burn for 4 hours total, maintaining consistent heat. Then he allowed it to die down to coals. The question now was thermal retention. Would the earth around the pipes hold heat, or would everything cool rapidly once the fire diminished? He placed his hand on the earth in multiple locations, memorizing the temperature, and settled in to wait through the evening and night. Thomas woke at first light on June 9th. The fire had gone completely cold during the night. He had slept fitfully, waking periodically to check the system. Each time, the buried pipes had still felt warm to the touch. Now, approximately 10 hours after the fire had died, he conducted systematic measurements. He placed his hand on the earth directly above the outbound pipe. It was warm, not hot, but distinctly warmer than the surrounding floor area. He moved to the return pipe location, also warm. He checked the corners of the cabin farthest from the fireplace and the pipe runs. Those areas were cool, matching the morning air temperature. The difference was unmistakable. The earth surrounding the pipes had absorbed heat and was retaining it hours after the heat source stopped. This was the critical proof of concept. A fireplace heated a cabin only while burning. Once the fire died, interior temperature dropped rapidly toward exterior temperature. Thomas's system was different. The earth acted as thermal mass, a heat battery that charged while the fire burned and discharged slowly over many hours. If he maintained a fire during evening and let it die overnight, The stored heat in the earth should keep the floor warm until morning. He rebuilt the fire and repeated the previous day's test, this time taking more detailed observations. He placed small stones at various distances from the pipe runs and checked their temperature periodically. Stones directly above the pipes became too hot to hold comfortably. Stones 2 feet away became warm. Stones 4 feet away showed slight warming. The heat was radiating outward through the earth in a predictable pattern. By evening, Thomas had confirmed the basic function. His system heated the earth beneath his cabin floor using gravity-driven water circulation. The earth retained that heat for extended periods. The next question was whether this underground heating would actually warm the cabin interior once he replaced the floor. The earth was one thing. Air temperature was another. He needed the floor itself to become warm enough to radiate heat upward into the living space. On June 10th, he began backfilling the trenches. He had removed approximately 2 cubic yards of earth during excavation. Now he shoveled it back carefully, packing it around the pipes. He didn't bury them completely yet. He wanted to run additional tests with the pipes partially exposed to verify the system's performance before committing to full installation. He maintained fires for 3 consecutive days, heating the system during daylight and evening, letting it cool overnight. Each cycle, the earth around the pipes became warmer. The thermal mass was accumulating heat, the temperature climbing gradually as the earth absorbed energy faster than it dissipated. By the 3rd day, the earth remained noticeably warm, even after 12 hours without fire. The system was working better than his initial calculations had predicted. Thomas completed the backfilling on June 14th. He packed earth around the pipes until the trenches were filled level with the surrounding floor. The surface was rough, uneven in places where settling had occurred. He tamped it down systematically, creating as level a base as possible for the floorboards he would reinstall. The planks had been stacked outside for 3 weeks. He inspected each one, checking for warping or damage from weather exposure. Most were fine. A few had developed slight curves from uneven drying. He set those aside to use in less critical locations. The straightest planks would go directly over the pipe runs, where levelness mattered most. He started laying floor at the fireplace end, working toward the far wall. Each plank had to be positioned carefully to avoid creating gaps that would let heat escape or allow dirt to work its way up from below. Thomas had never paid this much attention to floor installation before. Standard practice was to lay planks quickly and accept minor imperfections. Now he treated each board as a critical component of his heating system. The first plank went down directly over the outbound pipe run. Thomas knelt on it, feeling through the wood for any sense of warmth from below. He had maintained a small fire all morning to keep the system active. The plank felt normal, perhaps slightly less cold than floorboards usually felt, but nothing dramatic. He continued installing boards, working methodically across the cabin width. By afternoon, he had covered both pipe runs and was working on the sections between and beyond them. The floor was taking shape again, transforming the torn-apart cabin back into recognizable living space. Thomas felt relief at seeing his home restored, but also anxiety. The system was now buried. If something failed, if a joint leaked or a pipe cracked, he would have to tear everything up again to repair it. He finished the floor installation as the sun was setting. Every plank was in place. The cabin looked normal again, as if the past 3 weeks of destructive labor had never happened. Thomas built up the fire to a strong heat and let it burn into the evening. He sat on his newly reinstalled floor, waiting to feel whether his theory would translate into practical warmth. An hour passed. The fire roared, heating the reservoir pot until steam occasionally hissed from the water surface. Thomas moved around the cabin, placing his hands on different floor sections. The planks directly over the pipes were noticeably warm now, warm enough that the sensation was unmistakable. The heat was conducting upward through packed earth and wooden planks into the air above. He removed his boots and stood barefoot on the floor above the outbound pipe. The The wood felt pleasant against his skin, not hot, but comfortably warm. The kind of warmth you might feel from floorboards that had been in sunlight all day. He walked to the far corner of the cabin, the area that had always been coldest. The floor there was cooler, but not cold. The entire surface had equalized to a temperature well above what any frontier cabin normally achieved. Thomas spent the remainder of June and all of July refining his system. The basic function was proven, but efficiency needed improvement. He discovered that water level in the reservoir affected circulation speed. Too little water and the system didn't circulate properly. Too much and the reservoir overflowed when thermal expansion increased volume. He settled on a fill level that left 2 inches of Kong space at the top, enough to accommodate expansion without waste. He experimented with fire intensity. A roaring blaze heated the water quickly, but consumed wood at unsustainable rates. A moderate fire took longer to achieve operating temperature, but maintained steady circulation with less fuel. He learned to build fires that provided consistent heat rather than dramatic flames. The goal was sustained warming, not peak temperature. The reservoir position needed adjustment. Initially, he had placed it directly beside the fireplace where flames could heat it most efficiently. This worked, but created a hazard. Water boiling violently occasionally splashed onto the cabin floor. He moved the pot slightly farther from direct flame contact, positioning it where radiant heat would warm it thoroughly without causing violent boiling. Circulation slowed marginally but became more stable. Thomas also refined his understanding of the thermal mass effect. The earth around the pipes didn't heat instantly. It required several hours of continuous fire to reach operating temperature. But once heated, it retained warmth remarkably well. He could build a strong fire in the evening, let it burn for 4 hours, then bank the coals and sleep. The floor remained warm until morning. This pattern used far less wood than maintaining fire all night, as most frontier families did. He kept detailed notes in his journal, recording fire duration, estimated wood consumption, and subjective observations about floor temperature. The notes showed clear patterns. A 4-hour evening fire kept the floor comfortably warm for approximately 10 hours. A 6-hour fire extended that to 12 hours. Longer fires showed diminishing returns because the earth reached a saturation point where it couldn't absorb additional heat efficiently. By early August, Thomas had established an optimal operating routine. He built fires in late afternoon and maintained them into evening. This heated the system during the coldest part of the approaching night. He used approximately half the wood he had previously burned to heat his cabin through comparable periods. The floor stayed consistently warm rather than alternating between hot near the fire and frozen in corners. The system had limitations. It didn't heat the cabin air as quickly as a roaring fireplace. On extremely cold days, the air temperature near the ceiling remained cool, even with the floor warm. But the overall comfort was superior. Thomas found he could sit anywhere in his cabin and feel warmth radiating up from below. His feet, which had always been cold in winter, now rested on warm planks regardless of where he positioned himself. Word of Thomas's floor excavation project had spread through the scattered settlement during the summer. Trappers and settlers talked during chance encounters, and the story of the man who tore up his cabin to bury pipes became a source of amusement. Most assumed the project had failed, and Thomas had quietly abandoned it. When Robert Sutter visited again in mid-August, he expected to find the cabin restored to normal with the pipes removed and sold. Instead, he found Thomas living comfortably in a cabin that looked completely normal, except for the iron pot beside the fireplace. Robert asked if the heating system had worked. Thomas said it had exceeded expectations. Robert's expression showed polite disbelief. The weather was warm. There was no way to demonstrate floor heating in August. Thomas didn't argue. He invited Robert to return in winter when the system's value would be obvious. Two other neighbors visited in September. William and Catherine Morrison had a homestead 5 miles north. They had heard various versions of the pipe burial story and came partly out of curiosity, partly to see if Thomas needed help, after what they assumed was a failed experiment. Thomas showed them the system, explaining the thermosophon principle and the thermal mass effect. William listened politely, but clearly thought Thomas had wasted significant money and effort on an overly complicated solution to a simple problem. "Just build bigger fires," William suggested. Thomas replied that bigger fires consumed more wood and still left. "Corners cold." Catherine asked practical questions. How much did the materials cost? Thomas told her honestly, $130, including pipe, fittings, and the reservoir pot. Catherine's eyes widened. That was more than their entire cabin had cost to build. She asked if the system would save that much in reduced wood consumption. Thomas admitted he didn't know yet. He hadn't been through a full winter with it. The Morrisons left friendly but unconvinced. The conversations bothered Thomas less than he expected. He had built the system for himself, not to impress neighbors. Their skepticism was reasonable. He was claiming that buried pipes could heat a cabin more effectively than the traditional methods every frontier family used. Without winter demonstration, the claim sounded absurd. He would prove the system's worth when temperatures dropped and his floor remained warm while others froze. In October, the first cold nights arrived. Frost appeared on grass in the mornings. Thomas began running his heating system regularly, building fires each evening and monitoring performance. The floor warmed reliably, maintaining comfortable temperature through the night. He walked barefoot inside his cabin while outside temperatures dropped toward freezing. The contrast was remarkable. His feet had always been cold in autumn. Now they were warm. He thought about Daniel Hartwell during those October evenings. The boy had died because his cabin's floor was too cold, because the temperature differential between fireplace area and sleeping area had been too extreme. Thomas's system eliminated that differential. Every square foot of his floor was roughly the same temperature. A child could sleep anywhere safely. The first serious cold arrived in late November 1841. Temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there for 5 consecutive nights. This was the test Thomas had been anticipating since June. His system would either prove itself under genuine winter conditions or reveal fatal flaws that summer testing had missed. He maintained fires according to his established routine, heating the system for 4 to 6 hours each evening and letting thermal mass carry through the night. The floor performed exactly as his calculations predicted. Surface temperature remained stable around 65 degrees, regardless of outside conditions. Thomas walked barefoot inside his cabin while ice formed on the exterior walls. The contrast was so dramatic, it seemed almost unnatural. He had grown accustomed over years of frontier living to cold floors, to the necessity of wearing boots indoors, to feet that ached from constant chill. Now his floors were warm enough to be pleasant against bare skin. He monitored wood consumption carefully. Before installing his system, Thomas had burned approximately 1 cord of wood per month during deep winter to maintain livable conditions. That meant keeping fires burning almost continuously, feeding logs every few hours day and night. The consumption rate was exhausting and required stockpiling massive quantities of firewood before winter arrived. With the floor heating system, his consumption dropped to roughly half a cord per month. He burned fires for shorter periods, relying on thermal mass to maintain warmth during hours when no fire burned. The savings were substantial. Over a 5-month winter, he would save 2.5 cords of wood. At current rates, purchasing that much wood would cost approximately $25. He would recoup his system installation cost in roughly 5 years through fuel savings alone. But the real value wasn't economic, it was comfort and safety. Thomas could sleep anywhere in his cabin without risk of dangerous cold. He could work at his table in the corner farthest from the fireplace without losing feeling in his toes. He could sit reading in the evening without huddling near flames. The cabin had transformed from a shelter that provided minimal protection against winter into a genuinely comfortable living space. In early December, Marcus Hartwell visited. Thomas hadn't seen Marcus since Daniel's funeral. The man looked older, worn down by grief and the relentless difficulty of frontier life. Marcus had heard rumors about Thomas's heating system and came to see it himself. Thomas welcomed him inside, and Marcus immediately noticed the temperature difference. The cabin was warm throughout, not just near the fireplace. The floor felt warm under his boots. Thomas explained the system, showed Marcus the reservoir, and described the buried pipes. Marcus asked questions, technical questions about construction and operation. Thomas answered honestly, sharing everything he had learned. Marcus asked the cost. Thomas told him. Marcus was silent for a long moment, then said he would build one next summer. January 1842 brought the coldest weather Thomas had experienced since arriving in Montana. Temperatures remained below zero for 3 weeks straight, occasionally dropping to 20 or 30 below during clear nights. Wind came down from the north in sustained blasts that found every weakness in every structure. This was survival weather, the kind of cold that killed livestock and endangered anyone caught outside for extended periods. Thomas maintained his heating system throughout the crisis. He burned fires longer during the extreme cold, sometimes 6 or 8 hours per evening, to keep the thermal mass fully charged. Wood consumption increased, but remained well below what he had used in previous winters. The floor stayed consistently warm. Inside his cabin, conditions remained comfortable enough that he could work, sleep, and live normally while outside the world was lethally frozen. Other families in the scattered settlement suffered. Livestock died despite efforts to shelter them. Cabins that seemed adequate in normal winter became barely habitable torture chambers. Families burned furniture when firewood ran low. Children developed frostbite from sleeping in corners too far from inadequate fires. The Morrisons lost 3 chickens and a pig to cold. Robert Sutter's wife became seriously ill with respiratory infection that Robert attributed to the constant cold inside their cabin. In mid-January, several families gathered at the Fort Benton trading post to purchase emergency supplies. Thomas was there selling pelts. Conversation turned inevitably to the brutal cold and how people were surviving. Robert Sutter mentioned Thomas's floor heating system, describing it as the strangest thing he had seen, but admitting it apparently worked. Others asked questions. How did it function? What did it cost? Could existing cabins be modified, or did the system require new construction? Thomas found himself explaining thermosophon principles and thermal mass theory to a group of skeptical but desperate frontiersmen. He didn't exaggerate or make grand claims. He simply described what he had built and what results he had observed. His floor maintained temperature around 65 degrees, with fires burning 4 to 6 hours per day. Wood consumption was roughly half what traditional heating required. The system had operated reliably for 7 months without mechanical failure. The response was mixed. Some listeners clearly thought Thomas was exaggerating, or that his system worked due to some unique factor that wouldn't translate to their situations. Others were genuinely interested, asking detailed questions about pipe installation and reservoir design. Marcus Hartwell spoke up, confirming he had visited Thomas's cabin and felt the warm floor himself. Marcus's endorsement carried weight. He was known as honest and practical, not given to supporting foolish ideas. By the time the gathering dispersed, 3 men had asked Thomas to help them build similar systems when weather permitted construction. He agreed, saying he would share everything he knew. The knowledge wasn't proprietary. If others could benefit from warmer cabins and reduced fuel consumption, Thomas saw no reason to withhold information. He remembered Daniel Hartwell freezing in the night and thought that if floor heating could prevent similar tragedies, It should spread as widely as possible. When the deep cold finally broke in late February, Thomas began receiving visits from neighbors wanting to discuss floor heating installation. The first was Marcus Hartwell, who came in early March with detailed questions about materials and construction sequence. Marcus had spent the winter planning. He had money saved and was ready to purchase pipes as soon as the trading post could arrange delivery. He wanted to complete installation before next winter. Thomas walked Marcus through the entire process, from floor removal to final restoration. He explained the importance of trench depth and proper pipe pitch for thermosiphon circulation. He described the gasket installation technique and reservoir positioning. Marcus took notes, sketching diagrams and asking clarification questions. By the end of the conversation, Marcus understood the system thoroughly enough to build his own. In April, William Morrison arrived with similar intent. William had been skeptical during his summer visit, but the brutal January cold had changed his perspective. His family had suffered through weeks of barely tolerable conditions while knowing Thomas's cabin remained comfortable. William's wife, Catherine, had insisted they investigate the heating system seriously. William swallowed his pride and asked Thomas for guidance. Thomas repeated his explanation, tailoring it to William's situation. The Morrison cabin was smaller than Thomas's, requiring less pipe and a smaller reservoir. William could potentially build a functional system for under $100 if he sourced materials carefully. Thomas offered to help with the installation, knowing that first-time builders often struggled with details that seemed simple in explanation but proved tricky in practice. By May, 4 different families were actively planning floor heating installations. The trading post received multiple orders for large-diameter pipe, so many that the post trader commented he had never seen such demand for industrial materials from the trapping community. Word had spread beyond immediate neighbors. Settlers 20 and 30 miles away heard stories about warm floors and reduced wood consumption. Some made the journey to Fort Benton specifically to see Thomas's cabin and ask questions. Thomas became an unlikely expert, consulted on heating system design by men who months earlier had laughed at his project. He found the attention uncomfortable, but accepted it as responsibility. He had developed a solution to a genuine problem. Others needed that solution. Sharing knowledge freely seemed the right approach, though some suggested he should charge consulting fees or demand payment for his expertise. He refused payment. The system worked because of principles Heinrich Vogel had taught him years ago. Heinrich had shared that knowledge freely, training Thomas in engineering concepts without expectation of compensation beyond honest work. Thomas felt he should do the same. He helped Marcus Hartwell install pipes in late May, working 3 days alongside Marcus to excavate trenches and position the system correctly. He advised William Morrison on reservoir design, suggesting modifications that would work better in the Morrison cabin's layout. By the fall of 1842, 7 cabins within 30 miles of Fort Benton had functional floor heating systems. Each installation was slightly different, adapted to specific cabin layouts and builder preferences, but all followed the core principles Thomas had established: buried pipes, gravity-driven circulation, thermal mass storage, evening fires heating systems that maintained warmth through the night. The technique was spreading organically through the frontier community, shared between neighbors, and adapted by individual builders. The second winter provided validation beyond what Thomas had imagined. All 7 heated cabins performed well, maintaining comfortable floor temperatures through cold that matched the previous year's severity. Families who had installed systems reported dramatic improvements in living conditions. Children slept safely in any location. Adults worked comfortably throughout their cabin interiors. Wood consumption dropped by 40 to 60%, depending on cabin size and insulation quality. The economic and comfort benefits were undeniable. Stories began circulating among the wider trapping and settler community. The warm floor cabins became known throughout the region. Travelers sought them out as overnight stops, preferring heated floors to traditional cold accommodations. The phrase, "built like Brennan's floor," entered local vocabulary as a compliment indicating superior construction and thoughtful design. Thomas heard this phrase used and felt uncomfortable with the personal attribution, but the name stuck, regardless of his preferences. In 1843, the Fort Benton Trading Post stocked large-diameter pipe as regular inventory rather than special order items. Demand had become predictable. New settlers arriving in the territory heard about floor heating before they even built their first cabins. Some planned installations from the beginning rather than retrofitting existing structures. The technique was no longer experimental. It had become established frontier technology, proven through multiple winters and multiple installations. Marcus Hartwell became an advocate as passionate as Thomas had ever been. Marcus built 3 additional systems for neighbors in 1843, using knowledge Thomas had shared and techniques Marcus had refined through his own experience. Marcus told anyone who would listen that floor heating had transformed his family's winter survival from desperate endurance to reasonable comfort. He credited Thomas with saving lives through innovation and generosity. Thomas appreciated the recognition, but felt the credit was misplaced. He had simply applied principles Heinrich had taught him, adapted them to frontier conditions, and shared the results. The system worked because thermodynamics and gravity were reliable, not because Thomas possessed special genius. Anyone with basic mechanical understanding could have developed the same solution if they had thought to try. The real achievement was recognizing that traditional methods weren't the only methods, that problems accepted as unsolvable might yield to different approaches. Thomas Brennan continued trapping and living in Montana until 1847. By then, floor heating systems had spread throughout the northern Rocky Mountain settlements. The technique had evolved beyond his original design. Some builders used smaller, diameter pipes arranged in more complex patterns. Others experimented with different reservoir configurations or circulation paths. A few innovators developed variations using heated stones instead of water pipes. The core principle remained constant: heat the floor from below, using thermal mass to store and radiate warmth. By 1850, an estimated 40 to 60 cabins across Montana and Wyoming territories incorporated some form of floor heating. The exact number was impossible to determine because construction happened organically without central record keeping. Families built systems, shared knowledge with neighbors, and moved on with their lives. The innovation became ordinary, a standard technique rather than remarkable experiment. New settlers arriving from the east learned about floor heating as part of basic frontier construction knowledge. Thomas left Montana in 1847, drawn west by opportunities in Oregon Territory. The fur trade had collapsed completely by then. Beaver were scarce, and silk had permanently replaced felt in hat manufacturing. Men who had made fortunes trapping in the 1830s were now farmers, merchants, or manual laborers. Thomas used his savings to purchase land in the Willamette Valley and established a small farm. He married in 1849 a widow named Ellen Cartwright, who had come west with a wagon train. They raised 3 children together. He built his Oregon farmhouse with floor heating installed from the beginning. The Oregon climate was milder than Montana, but winter still brought cold rain and occasional freezing temperatures. His warm floors were appreciated by Ellen and the children, though none of them fully understood how unusual the system was. To them, it was simply how their house worked. Thomas never spoke much about his Montana years or the innovation that had spread his name through frontier communities. By 1860, floor heating systems had appeared in settlements as far south as Colorado and as far west as California. The technique traveled with migrants, carried in memories and journal notes and verbal instructions. Some installations failed due to poor construction or misunderstood principles. Others worked beautifully, maintaining warmth through decades of winter seasons. The successful systems justified the installation costs through fuel savings and comfort improvements. The failed systems taught builders what not to do. Thomas never profited financially from his innovation. He had shared the knowledge freely and never attempted to claim ownership or demand licensing fees. Others built businesses around floor heating installation, charging for their labor and expertise. Thomas felt no resentment about this. The goal had been solving a problem, not creating commercial enterprise. The problem was solved. Families slept safely on warm floors instead of risking hypothermia in frozen corners. That outcome justified every dollar spent and every hour of labor invested in the original experimental system. Thomas Brennan died in 1873 at age 64 on his Oregon farm. A fever took him suddenly in early spring. Ellen buried him in the small cemetery outside their nearest town. His children inherited the farm and continued working it for another generation. The farmhouse with its warm floors remained occupied until the early 1900s, when it was eventually demolished to make way for a more modern structure. No one thought to preserve it or mark its historical significance. By the time of Thomas's death, floor heating had become common enough in Western settlements that no one associated the technique with a specific inventor. It was simply something people did if they had the resources and knowledge. Improvements and variations had evolved so far beyond Thomas's original design that the connection to his 1841 experimental installation was completely lost. He had become anonymous, his contribution absorbed into the collective knowledge of frontier construction. In the 1880s and 90s, as Montana and Wyoming transitioned from frontier territories to established states, old-timers occasionally mentioned the warm floor cabins of earlier decades. A few remembered Thomas Brennan's name in connection with floor heating, but most of those memories died with the men who held them. No written records documented Thomas's innovation. No newspapers had covered the story. Frontier life was too chaotic and scattered for systematic historical record-keeping. Modern historians studying frontier heating methods occasionally encounter references to floor heating systems in personal journals and letters from the 1840s and 50s. These references describe the systems as established technology, mentioning them casually without attribution or origin stories. One journal entry from 1846 notes that the warm floor method saves considerable wood and keeps the children healthy through winter. Another letter from 1852 mentions installing pipes beneath our cabin floor following the method now common throughout the territory. Archaeological surveys of abandoned frontier cabin sites have occasionally uncovered buried pipe systems. These discoveries puzzle researchers because the technology seems advanced for the period and location. The pipes are substantial, professionally manufactured items found in crude frontier cabins built with hand tools. The contrast suggests either that the builders had unexpected resources or that they valued heating innovation enough to invest heavily in it. Without written documentation, the full story remains obscure. What can be documented is impact. Frontier mortality rates from cold-related causes decreased measurably in regions where floor heating became common. Children especially benefited. Hypothermia deaths among children in heated cabins were rare compared to traditional structures. Respiratory illnesses decreased when families could maintain consistent interior temperatures instead of suffering extreme variations between fireside heat and corner cold. The innovation saved lives, though the numbers saved and the specific cases can never be fully tallied. Thomas Brennan's legacy exists not in monuments or historical markers, but in the warm floors of structures he never saw, built by people who never knew his name, keeping families safe through winters that would otherwise have threatened them. The impossible had become ordinary. The system that seemed insane when Thomas first proposed it had become standard practice, so thoroughly integrated into frontier construction knowledge that its origins were forgotten while its benefits endured.